The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. What was it? What was its effect in the United States leading up to the Civil War? And how does it relate to the ideas of justice? So, what were the Fugitive Slave Laws? The Fugitive Slave Laws were a pair of laws that legalized the capture and return of escaped slaves. The first Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793, and this gave local governments the authority to search for, capture, and return runaway slaves. Once a slave was captured, the owners had to go before a judge and prove that the slave belonged to them. A court official would then sign an affidavit once they were content with the proof that was provided, and at that point, the owner was free to take the slave home with them. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a revised version of the previous act. This was considerably more severe. Consequences for those who assisted escaped slaves were significantly harsher, and citizens were held responsible for aiding in the capture of fugitives. By the year 1787, a majority of northern states had abolished slavery. This led to the South growing fearful that these particular states would become safe havens for slaves who had escaped. Because of this, they called upon the Fugitive Slave Clause that was located in the Constitution. This clause read that no person held to service or labor would be released from bondage because they escaped to a free state. So, history of the Fugitive Slave Laws. Because there was such a significant amount of pushback to the clause, Congress eventually passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This act was more descriptive than the Fugitive Slave Clause on how slaves could be captured, and it detailed punishments for anyone who aided escaped slaves. The Northerners severely criticized this act and made efforts to help slaves who had escaped to free states. They took huge strides. A lot of these states passed personal liberty laws, which gave runaways the right to trial by jury. They also protected free African Americans who had been captured and then sold into slavery. And a lot of these states also prohibited the use of their jails for holding captured slaves. So finally, we have the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Following intense pressure from Southern politicians, Congress passed the revised version of the Fugitive Slave Act on September 18, 1850. This revision was significantly more intense. It forced citizens to comply with provisions, as well as outlined harsher punishments for those who chose not to. There were fines up to $1,000, possible imprisonment in addition to those fines as well. We see the idea of a good citizen and a good human being sort of come into play with this law. A good citizen being someone who complies with laws and stands by them because those are the laws of their country. And then a good human being who is someone that genuinely cares about what is good and supporting what's moral, just because that's the right thing to do. Opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. There was a huge amount of opposition towards this act. It forced people to take sides on the issue of slavery, and this caused tensions between the North and the South. Political activist Harriet Tubman was responsible for thousands of slaves escaping capture. She worked the Underground Railroad, which is one of the most famous escape routes for slaves. The Underground Railroad helped slaves that escaped from border states such as Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. People known as conductors would lead fugitives on various routes. Routes stretched across the country. Some went through Ohio into Indiana. Others went more north up by New England, and then others went through Detroit into Canada. Private homes, churches, and schoolhouses were all used as hiding places for fugitives. These hiding places were often referred to as stations, and the people who ran them were considered station masters. What was the effect of the Fugitive Slave Act leading up to the war? The Fugitive Slave Act is considered to be one of the main driving forces of the Civil War. The act was initially meant to be a compromise and was supposed to alleviate tensions between the North and the South. However, it had the opposite effect. Many citizens resisted the law. They did not want to carry out the duties outlined in the law, and they refused to accept the consequences for it. Eventually, the South seceded and the Civil War began in 1861. Okay, so here we have some pictures that are really good visuals for the events surrounding the Fugitive Slave Act. On the top left, we see the American and Confederate flags, which were representative of the North and South, respectively, during the Civil War. Underneath that, we see a map of the Underground Railroad routes around 1860. This just highlights some of the routes that were used during this time. And then next to those pictures, we have the map of the United States in 1850. And you can see in the green is all of the free states and territories, and then in the red is going to be all the slave states and the slave territories. So how does the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 relate to the ideas of justice? The Fugitive Slave Act heavily impacted justice. As I mentioned earlier, the debate of the good citizen and the good human being is present throughout this issue. Individuals who chose to comply with the law did so either because they agreed with it or to avoid receiving the consequences of resisting. The good citizen is exhibited here. They were supporting the laws of the country because they felt that it was the right thing to do, despite knowing that the law was immoral. On the flip side, we have people who actively opposed the law, such as Harriet Tubman, because they believed it to be unjust and wrong. These were ones who fought back against slavery and contributed to its demise. These people are considered to be good human beings, supporting what was right, not just what their country was telling them to do. The Civil War was such a huge milestone for African Americans in this country. It led to the abolition of slavery, freeing over 4 million enslaved people, and it also forced our country to take a step towards equality.